Imagine a war that, well, despite ending largely where it began, completely reshaped a continent.
Hmm.
A conflict that, gave us a national anthem,
Yeah.
involved everything from trade disputes to really fierce battles on land and sea.
Right.
And get this, some battles were even fought after a peace treaty was signed.
It's pretty wild. Today, we're taking a deep dive into exactly that, the War of 1812.
Yeah, let's do it.
And our goal here, our mission for you, is to unpack its complex origins, sort of navigate the multiple battlefronts,
Okay.
understand some of the surprising human stories woven throughout, and really grasp the profound long-term consequences. It's a war that often gets overshadowed, but it was incredibly formative for North America.
Definitely. And you've shared some excellent sources, really comprehensive stuff. We're here to pull out the most important insights for you. Make sure you get a thorough understanding without getting totally bogged down in every detail.
Exactly. So the War of 1812, fought by the United States and its allies against the United Kingdom and its allies right here in North America.
Ran from June 18th, 1812 to February 17th, 1815. And what's fascinating right off the bat is how differently it's remembered or even named, depending on where you are.
Oh, absolutely. In Britain, for example, it's often just called the American War of 1812.
Right, to keep it separate from...
The Napoleonic Wars, which were, their main event at the time. That was the big one for them.
Makes sense. Then, over in the U.S., you had the Federalist Party. They were strongly against the war. They called it Mr. Madison's War.
Pointing the finger directly at the president.
Exactly. But for many other Americans, it became known as the Second American War of Independence.
Or even the Second American Revolution.
Yeah, which really highlights this belief that American sovereignty was genuinely on the line again.
So multiple names, multiple perspectives, right from the very start. It tells you a lot.
It really does. Okay, so let's dig into those origins. Why 1812? Why did this conflict, which sometimes feels almost accidental, actually happen?
Well, it wasn't just one thing, was it? You had these long simmering tensions between the U.S. and Britain.
Like what specifically?
Things like American ambitions for territorial expansion clashing with British interests, especially British support for Tecumseh's Confederacy.
Oh, right. They were resisting U.S. settlement in the Old Northwest.
Precisely. That was a constant source of friction on the frontier. But the really big flashpoints, for many Americans anyway, came from the sea, maritime grievances.
Okay, tell us about those.
By 1807, things really heated up because the Royal Navy was imposing these super tight restrictions on American trade with France. Britain and France were at war, of course.
Right, the Napoleonic Wars again.
Exactly. And even more controversial was impressment.
The forced recruitment.
Yeah, forcing seamen off U.S. ships into the Royal Navy. And this wasn't just, British deserters they were grabbing.
No, it often included men who were actually American citizens, sometimes naturalized, sometimes native-born.
And the U.S. position was clear. This was illegal under international law. A total violation of their sovereignty.
You can see how that would stir up anger.
Absolutely. Then there's the whole Canada question. Some historians think the U.S. might have genuinely wanted to annex part or all of Canada.
A view many Canadians still hold today, I understand.
They do. Others argue it was more of a tactic, maybe a bargaining chip, to get concessions from Britain on other issues.
Interesting debate.
But beyond territory, beyond trade, there was this powerful undercurrent of national honor. The U.S. felt repeatedly insulted by Britain. Think of the Chesapeake Affair, for instance.
Yeah, that was a big one. A real slap in the face.
So you've got trade, impressment, territory honor. It's all brewing.
And this idea of national honor, it must have been potent because when Congress actually voted for war in June 1812, the nation was just incredibly divided.
Deeply split. It fell almost perfectly along party lines.
The Democratic Republicans were for it, the Federalists against it.
And the vote itself passed by the smallest margin of any war declaration in U.S. history. That tells you everything about the division.
Wow. Talk about going to war on a knife's edge.
Exactly. And speaking of timing, here's a really kind of tragic twist.
Okay.
The British Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, the guy really behind those tough maritime policies, he was assassinated in May 1812.
Right before the Declaration.
Just weeks before.
Yeah.
And his successor, Lord Liverpool, actually wanted a more, practical relationship with the U.S. He moved to repeal the orders in council, those trade restrictions that were a primary cause of the conflict.
He repealed them when?
He issued the repeal on June 23rd.
But wait, the U.S. declared war on June 18th?
Precisely. The news of the repeal didn't reach the U.S. until late July. By then, the war machine was already in motion.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. A communication delay that changed history. You wonder what might have happened if the news had arrived just a few weeks earlier.
It's one of those great what-ifs, isn't it? So war is declared, but as you mentioned, neither side was really geared up for it.
Not at all. Britain was pouring resources into fighting Napoleon.
Right. The bulk of their experienced army was in the Peninsular War, fighting in Spain and Portugal. They only had about 6,000 regular troops actually stationed in Canada in July 1812.
And the Royal Navy. Huge, yes, but spread thin.
Over 600 ships globally, but only around 85 in American waters.
Yeah?
Their main job was still blockading the French.
So their focus was definitely elsewhere. What about the U.S. military?
Pretty underwhelming, frankly. The regular army had fewer than 12,000 men initially.
Oof.
They had to rely heavily on state militias, which were often poorly trained, ill-disciplined.
And sometimes unwilling to fight outside their own state, let alone in Canada.
Exactly. There were instances where militias just refused to cross the border. The U.S. Navy, on the other hand, was actually quite professional and well-trained.
But tiny.
Very small. Only 14 ocean-going warships, and none of the massive ships of the line needed for big fleet battles. Their strategy had to be different.
Focused on commerce raiding, using those heavier frigates they'd built.
Right. Frigates designed to be bigger and punch harder than their European counterparts.
It really does sound like David versus Goliath, at least on paper. But there was another key factor, wasn't there? The indigenous allies.
Absolutely crucial, especially for the British in Canada. They desperately needed allies to make up for their lack of numbers.
Tecumseh's Confederacy in the west, the Iroquois in the east.
Yeah, and they were incredibly effective at irregular warfare. Raids, ambushes, using the terrain. They knew how to fight in that environment.
And it's important to remember, they weren't just British pawns.
Not at all. They were allies with their own goals, fighting alongside the British when it suited their interests and the conditions were right for their tribes.
So President Madison signs the Declaration on June 18, 1812, and again with the timing. News of the war reaches the British commander in Upper Canada, Isaac Brock, way faster than the news of the orders and council repeal reached the U.S.
Another quirk of communication back then. And Brock didn't hesitate. He immediately ordered the capture of Fort Mackinac.
A key fur trade post.
Right. Using fur traders and indigenous allies, they took it quickly. A very early symbolic victory for the British.
And so the fighting begins, spreading across these different theaters. Let's start with that Western Front. Early American invasions of Canada.
The very first one was led by William Hull, starting July 12th. But he made some serious missteps.
Like threatening British soldiers fighting alongside indigenous allies.
Yeah, that backfired badly. It just stiffened resistance. Hull ended up retreating and then surrendering the entire fort of Detroit on August 16th to Isaac Brock.
Brock really showed some bold leadership there.
He did. Hull, on the other hand, was later court-martialed for cowardice and neglect of duty. A really disastrous start for the U.S. campaign in the West.
Ouch, and things got brutal. The River Raisin Massacre.
Yes, in January 1813, after a battle near Frenchtown, about 60 captured American soldiers were killed by Potawatomi allies of the British. Remember, the River Raisin became a powerful, vengeful rallying cry for the Americans.
But the tide started to turn for the U.S. in the West, didn't it? Lake Erie was key.
Hugely important. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry's naval victory on Lake Erie, September 10, 1813.
We have met the enemy, and they are ours. Iconic.
Absolutely. That victory gave the U.S. control of the lake, forced the British to abandon Detroit, and opened the door for General William Henry Harrison to invade Upper Canada again.
Which led to the Battle of the Thames.
October 5th, 1813. A decisive American victory, and crucially, the battle where Tecumseh was killed.
His death was a massive blow to indigenous resistance in the region, wasn't it?
A devastating blow. He was such a unifying figure. His loss really fragmented the alliance and shifted the power dynamics significantly.
Meanwhile, further west, along the Mississippi.
Yeah, heavy fighting there too. Fort Madison had to be abandoned by the Americans after attacks by British allied Sauk. The British and their allies controlled a lot of what's now Illinois and Wisconsin after winning battles at Prairie du Chien, Rock Island Rapids, Credit Island.
And incredibly, the fighting there between Americans and indigenous tribes didn't even stop when the war officially ended.
No, it continued sporadically until 1817. The peace treaty didn't automatically mean peace on the far frontier.
Okay, let's shift to the Northeast. Control of the Great Lakes was obviously critical there, too.
Paramount. It was a naval arms race, in a way. The U.S. built a major shipyard at Sackett's Harbor, New York, churning out 11 warships.
And there were raids back and forth. The Americans attacked York Modern Toronto in April 1813.
Right, burning the legislature building, looting homes. That really, really angered the British and Canadians. It set a precedent for retaliation.
And the American advance into Upper Canada kind of stalled after that, didn't it? British counterattacks, figures like Laura Secord.
Exactly. The Battle of Stony Creek was a setback for the Americans, and Laura Secord's famous walk to warn the British about an impending attack at Beaver Dams led directly to a significant American surrender. These smaller actions really added up.
And the burning just escalated. Americans burned Newark in December 1813.
And the British hit back hard, capturing Fort Niagara, burning Lewiston, burning Buffalo. It got really nasty.
Meanwhile, attempts to invade Montreal were failing.
Yeah, the British, with Canadian militia and Mohawk allies under Charles de Salaberry, won a key victory at the Battle of the Chateauguay against a much larger American force in 1813. That stopped one invasion cold. Another attempt was beaten back at Chrysler's Farm. Montreal was safe.
Then 1814 rolls around, and Napoleon is out, at least for a while.
Right. His abdication frees up British resources. They send 15,000 veteran troops over to North America. Serious reinforcements.
How did that change things on the ground?
Well, the American army was also improving. Under Winfield Scott, they showed real professionalism at the Battle of Chippewa. But then came Lundy's Lane, New Niagara Falls, in July 1814.
The bloodiest battle of the war.
By far. And ultimately inconclusive. Both sides claimed victory, but it was a brutal stalemate. It showed the fighting was becoming much more intense, more professional on both sides.
But another major British push failed, didn't it? The invasion towards Plattsburgh?
Yes. In September 1814, a large British land force was advancing, but its supply line depended on controlling Lake Champlain. And American naval commander Thomas MacDonough won a decisive victory on the lake at the Battle of Plattsburgh.
Theodore Roosevelt called it the greatest naval battle of the war.
High praise.
Yeah.
It forced the British Army to retreat back to Canada, a really crucial American victory late in the war.
And totally separately, the British occupied a chunk of Maine.
Yeah, Castine and much of eastern Maine, they governed it under martial law, called it New Ireland.
New Ireland.
It was returned after the war, but the tariffs they collected, about 10,750 pounds, became the Castine Fund, which was actually used to help establish Dalhousie University in Halifax.
No kidding. And there's still a dispute over an island from that occupation.
Kias Seal Island. Yep, the sovereignty dispute stemming from that British occupation technically continues to this day.
Wow. Okay, let's turn to the Chesapeake campaign. This one feels different, a direct strike at the U.S. Capitol.
It was a bold move. The Chesapeake Bay was a key target. Rear Admiral George Cockburn started raids and a blockade back in 1813, hitting towns, destroying supplies.
But 1814 was the big one. Bladensburg.
August 1814, British troops under Major General Robert Ross, with Cockburn alongside, just routed the inexperienced American militia at the Battle of Bladensburg. It was embarrassingly one-sided. The road to Washington, D.C. was wide open.
And they marched right in.
On August 24th. After some looting, Ross ordered the burning of the major public buildings, the White House, the Capitol.
Unbelievable. The government fled.
They did. And the Americans actually burned the Washington Navy Yard themselves to stop the British from capturing the ships and supplies there. It was a low point for the U.S.
An image burned into history, like you said.
Yeah.
But the British didn't hold Washington. They moved on to Baltimore.
Right. But Baltimore put up a much tougher fight. At the Battle of North Point, just outside the city, the British commander, General Ross, was actually killed by American sharpshooters.
A big loss for them.
Huge. Then came the naval bombardment of Fort McHenry, guarding Baltimore Harbor. For 25 hours, the British pounded the fort.
But the fort held.
It held. The British couldn't pass. And that defiance, seeing the huge American flag still flying over the fort the next morning, is what inspired Francis Scott Key
to write the poem that became the Star-Spangled Banner. Amazing.
Truly, a moment of resilience born from near disaster.
Okay, let's head south now. The Southern Theater involved the Creek War, right?
Yes, which was initially an internal conflict within the Muskogee, or Creek, Nation. You had the Red Sticks faction, inspired by Tecumseh and getting some support from the British and Spanish.
And they attacked Fort Mims.
In August 1813, it was a brutal attack. 400 to 500 settlers and militia killed. It became another rallying cry for American frontiersmen demanding vengeance.
Enter Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson, commanding Tennessee militia alongside Cherokee allies and pro-American Creek warriors. He pursued the Red Sticks relentlessly.
Leading to the Battle of Horseshoe Bend.
March 1814. A decisive, crushing defeat for the Red Sticks. Jackson's forces killed about 800 of maybe 1,000 Red Stick warriors there. It effectively ended the Creek War.
And the treaty that followed was harsh.
The Treaty of Fort Jackson. The Creek were forced to cede enormous amounts of land, most of western Georgia, 2/3 of modern Alabama. Even the Creek, who had fought with Jackson, lost land.
Wow. And you mentioned the British were recruiting escaped slaves in the South.
Yes, a really interesting aspect. In May 1814, the British set up a post on Florida's Apalachicola River and actively recruited escaped slaves. Younger men volunteered for the Corps of Colonial Marines.
And they fought for Britain.
They did, serving throughout the Atlantic campaign, including the Chesapeake, a path to freedom for those individuals.
Then the British launched a big offensive on the Gulf Coast itself.
Right. Jackson took Spanish Pensacola in November 1814 to deny it to the British, and then came the main event down south, the push towards New Orleans.
The Battle of New Orleans. January 8th, 1815. Probably the most famous battle of the war for Americans.
And an absolutely stunning American victory, a catastrophic British defeat. You had about 8,000 British regulars under General Edward Pakenham attacking Andrew Jackson's well-prepared defensive line.
And the British casualties were staggering.
Just devastating. Over 2,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Pakenham himself was killed. American losses, meanwhile, were incredibly light, maybe a dozen or so killed, a few dozen wounded.
It cemented Jackson as a national hero, paved his way to the presidency later on.
No question. It was a massive morale boost for the U.S. But here's the kicker.
The timing again.
The timing. The Battle of New Orleans, this huge defining victory, was fought after the Treaty of Ghent, officially ending the war, had already been signed back in Europe in December 1814.
The news just hadn't crossed the Atlantic yet.
Exactly. It's almost unbelievable. All those lives lost in a battle fought after the peace deal was done.
Really underscores the realities of communication in that era. Okay, let's talk specifically about the war at sea. We touched on the mismatch, huge Royal Navy, tiny U.S. Navy.
Right. Britain ruled the waves, no doubt. Their main focus was blockading Napoleonic France. The U.S. Navy, with no big ships of the line, couldn't challenge them in a fleet action.
So the U.S. strategy had to be different. Hit and run, capturing merchant ships.
And leveraging those unique American frigates. Ships like the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, they were deliberately built bigger, tougher, with heavier guns, 24-pounders usually, than British frigates of the same nominal class.
Which led to some famous single-ship duels.
It did. Early in the war, American frigates won several stunning victories against British frigates. The Constitution defeated HMS Guerriere, then HMS Java. The USS United States captured HMS Macedonian. These victories were huge for American morale.
Kind of a David and Goliath story playing out on the waves.
It felt like that. The Royal Navy was actually shocked. They even issued secret orders telling their standard frigates not to engage the big American 44-gun frigates one-on-one if they could avoid it.
Wow. But as morale-boosting as those victories were, did they actually change the strategic situation at sea?
Not really, no. They were symbolic wins, but didn't break British naval dominance. What did hurt the British more, in terms of commerce, were the American privateers.
The licensed pirates.
Essentially, yeah. Privately owned armed ships given government permission to attack enemy merchant shipping. American privateers reported capturing around 1,300 British merchant vessels.
That must have stung. Though the Royal Navy captured American ships too, right?
Oh, yes. About 1,400 American merchant ships were captured by the Royal Navy. But the real game changer, the thing that truly crippled the U.S. economy, was the British blockade.
It started informally, but then got really tight.
It tightened dramatically by 1814, covering basically the entire American coast. For a while, they actually left New England ports somewhat open.
Why? Trying to encourage anti-war feelings there.
Partly that, and partly because Britain benefited from the trade, smuggling included. But eventually the blockade clamped down everywhere, and the economic impact was devastating.
Exports just collapsed.
Plummeted. From $130 million in 1807 down to just $7 million by 1814. Coastal shipping, the cheapest way to move goods, became impossible. Everything had to go overland on terrible roads, which was slow and expensive.
So the blockade was incredibly effective, and Halifax, Nova Scotia, benefited.
Hugely. It became the main Royal Navy base for managing the blockade, a hub of activity and wartime prosperity.
The blockade really forced the U.S. economy inward. Now, we mentioned the Corps of Colonial Marines, escaped slaves fighting for Britain. Let's talk more broadly about enslaved people during the war.
It's a really significant and often overlooked part of the story. The presence of the Royal Navy along the coast offered a real chance at freedom.
How many people escaped this way?
Estimates are around 4,000 African Americans managed to escape slavery by reaching British ships or lines. And by official British government order, once they reached British protection, they were considered free.
So this wasn't just commanders acting on their own. It was policy.
It was official policy. These individuals became known as black refugees.
And what happened to them?
They were transported and resettled in British territories, places like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, some went to Trinidad. And as we said, some of the younger men volunteered for the Corps of Colonial Marines.
It's remarkable. The largest emancipation of African Americans before the U.S. Civil War.
By far, a direct consequence of the conflict in British policy.
Okay, so while all this fighting and disruption is happening, peace talks eventually start. In Ghent.
Yes, in Ghent, which is in modern-day Belgium. Negotiations began in August 1814, and the initial demands from both sides were pretty far apart.
What did the British want initially?
They came in strong, partly because they expected their veteran troops to secure major victories. They demanded the creation of a buffer indigenous state in the American Northwest.
Wow, a separate country.
Effectively, yes. They also wanted naval control of the Great Lakes and guaranteed access to the Mississippi River.
And the Americans, what were their opening demands?
Well, they still harbored hopes, perhaps unrealistic by then, of acquiring the Canadas. And they wanted compensation for damages caused by British actions, like the Orders in Council.
So, miles apart. What broke the deadlock?
Primarily the changing situation in Europe. Napoleon's abdication in April 1814 was key. Suddenly, Britain's main strategic goals shifted. They needed to focus on rebuilding Europe, redrawing the map after decades of war.
And the reasons for fighting the U.S. seemed less important.
Exactly. They didn't need to impress sailors anymore. And back home in Britain, there was growing war weariness, opposition to wartime taxes. Merchants were desperate to resume trade with America.
So the political pressure shifted.
It did. Prime Minister Lord Liverpool basically told his negotiators in Ghent, look, let's just wrap this up. He pushed for a peace based on status quo antebellum.
Meaning?
Meaning, let's just put everything back the way it was before the war. No territory changes hands, no major concessions, just stop fighting.
A return to the starting point.
Pretty much. And so the Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1814.
Ratified by the British quickly.
Within 3 days. But again, communication delays meant it didn't officially end the war until the U.S. Congress ratified it on February 17, 1815, after news of the treaty finally arrived, and significantly, after news of Jackson's stunning victory at New Orleans arrived.
Which must have made Americans feel like they'd won, even though the treaty didn't reflect that.
Absolutely. The timing of the news shaped the perception dramatically. The treaty itself called for returning all occupied territory like that part of Maine and restoring the pre-war borders.
What about the escaped slaves, the black refugees? The treaty mentioned them.
It did. It stipulated their return to their American owners. But the British largely refused to comply with that clause.
They considered them free.
Yes. This led to years of dispute, and eventually Britain paid over $1.2 million in compensation to the U.S. government for the financial loss claimed by the slaveholders. A really complex diplomatic and human legacy there.
Truly. So, the war ends, essentially a draw on paper. What were the real aftermath effects, the lasting consequences?
Well, the human cost was significant. An estimated 15,000 American deaths from all causes, battle, disease, and perhaps 10,000 indigenous deaths, which is harder to track precisely but clearly devastating.
Financially.
Expensive for both. It added about $25 million to Britain's already massive national debt from the Napoleonic Wars, and around $90 million to the U.S. debt. But here's a fascinating economic outcome for the U.S.
Despite the debt and the blockade.
Yes, the American economy actually grew during the war years, maybe 3.7% annually, because money that would have gone to foreign trade thanks to the blockade got diverted into domestic manufacturing.
So the blockade, meant to cripple the U.S., actually spurred industrialization.
It gave a major, unexpected boost to the Industrial Revolution in the United States. New factories popped up, particularly in New England, to make goods they could no longer import easily. An unintended consequence.
That's incredible. What about national identity?
Hugely impacted. For the United States, even though the treaty was status quo, war fostered this powerful sense of complete independence from Britain. It really was seen and celebrated as a second war of independence.
And the Battle of New Orleans, even fought after the peace, sealed that feeling.
Absolutely. It provided that heroic narrative of standing up to the mighty British Empire and winning decisively, even if the treaty didn't reflect territorial gains. It fueled American nationalism immensely.
And politically within the U.S.
Massive changes. The Federalist Party, remember, they opposed the war, even held the Hartford Convention in late 1814 to discuss their grievances. Some even floated secession.
Bad timing for them, with the war ending and New Orleans happening.
Terrible timing. They looked disloyal, almost treasonous to many. The party basically collapsed as a national force soon after.
Ushering in the era of good feelings.
Exactly. A period of one-party dominance under the Democratic Republicans. And the war created new national heroes who became political giants.
Jackson, obviously. William Henry Harrison, too.
Both parlayed their military fame directly into the presidency later on.
What about the U.S.-Canada border?
The war essentially confirmed the existing border, but it led to efforts to prevent future conflict. The Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817 demilitarized the Great Lakes, a huge step towards the peaceful boundary we have today.
And it had knock-on effects further south, Florida.
Indirectly, yes. Andrew Jackson's invasion of Spanish Florida in 1818, technically chasing Seminoles but also seizing Spanish posts, showed Spain they couldn't really control the territory effectively. That helped pave the way for the U.S. to acquire Florida from Spain in 1819.
Okay, turning north, how did the war impact Canada?
For Canadians, or rather the people living in the Canadas then, the war was arguably their war of independence from American annexation attempts.
It forged a sense of identity.
Very much so. Fighting together against a common enemy helped create a sense of shared identity among diverse groups. British loyalists, French Canadians, recent immigrants. It also fostered a lasting hostility towards American expansionism and influence.
Leading to more defenses being built.
Yes, significant fortification projects along the border in the following decades, just in case.
So positive identity formation for the U.S. and Canada in different ways.
Yeah.
But who clearly lost out?
Unquestionably, the indigenous nations. They were the clear losers of the War of 1812.
How so?
The British, in the Treaty of Ghent, completely abandoned their demand for that independent indigenous buffer state they'd initially proposed. Tecumseh was dead, the Western Confederacy was broken.
And they lost territory.
Vast amounts of territory, both in the Old Northwest and in the South, through treaties like Fort Jackson. British policymakers after the war started viewing their former indigenous allies more as a burden than an asset. They largely stopped supplying them with arms and gifts.
Leaving them vulnerable to U.S. expansion.
Exactly. The U.S. rapidly asserted military control over those areas, and American fur traders pushed out the British traders who had worked with the tribes. It was a devastating turning point for indigenous sovereignty and power east of the Mississippi.
A truly tragic outcome. And finally, for the UK, how is the war remembered there?
Honestly, it's largely forgotten. A minor sideshow. Their focus was and remains in historical memory entirely on the colossal struggle against Napoleon.
So the loss of troops, the burning of Washington, the defeat at New Orleans, just a blip.
Pretty much a blip in the grand scheme of the Napoleonic Wars. The Royal Navy's overall dominance wasn't seriously challenged, British businesses were happy to resume trade, and that was mostly that. No lasting national trauma or celebration like in the U.S. or Canada.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for us today, this often overlooked war?
It profoundly shaped North America's map and its identities. It solidified the U.S.-Canada border, fostered distinct nationalisms on both sides, and crucially redirected the economic and political course of the young United States.
Resolving some issues through fighting while others just sort of faded away as the world changed.
Exactly. And maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. Consider how this conflict, ending essentially in a draw, a status quo ante bellum, still managed to be a catalyst for such huge shifts.
Right. Monumental changes in national identity, economic direction, the fate of indigenous nations, geopolitical alignment.
All stemming from a war with no clear winner on paper. How often do the most impactful changes come not from outright victory or defeat, but from the complex, often unintended consequences learned in the messy crucible of conflict itself? Something to think about.